A man can spend 27 years paying for a house with his own hands, his own sweat, his own silence, and still hear his son's voice on the phone one Thursday night treating that house like a problem to be solved. I am Caleb Monroe. I am 56 years old. I live on East Bolton Street in Savannah, Georgia. And until 8:17 on a Thursday evening in the middle of October, I believed I understood what family meant. I believed it the way you believe in the weight of wood when you press your palm against a doorframe you installed yourself. I believed it the way you believe in the reliability of a foundation you poured sweat into for nearly 3 decades. I believed it not because someone told me to, but because I had done the believing one payment at a time, one repair at a time, one quiet Saturday morning at a time for 27 years running. The ceiling fan in my kitchen has a sound. A low, steady, rhythmic complaint, not quite a squeak and not quite a hum, somewhere between the two. I have been meaning to fix it for 4 years. I never fix it because on hot evenings, when the windows are open and the jasmine is doing what jasmine does in Savannah in October, that sound is the sound of my house thinking. That is the only way I know how to put it. The fan thinks. The house breathes. I sit at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that has gone cold because I forgot about it, and I listen, and for a few minutes I am not a man with any particular weight to carry. That was what I was doing when the phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw Derek's name and felt the ordinary small warmth that a father feels when his son calls on a Thursday evening with no particular occasion. I answered on the second ring. I said, "Hello, son." And Derek said, without hesitation, without preamble, without a single breath that might have given me time to prepare, "Dad, we sold your house. You'll stay in the back room at Marissa's mother's place until we figure things out." I held the coffee cup. It was cold. The fan turned overhead. The jasmine came through the window. I said, "I understand." Those 2 words. I understand. They are the 2 words a man reaches for when his mind has gone somewhere beyond language, and his body is still sitting at a kitchen table in Savannah, Georgia. Pressing the heel of his palm against the grain of a wood table, he refinished himself 11 years ago on a summer weekend when Derek was visiting and sat on the porch reading a magazine instead of helping. I want to stop here for just a moment before I go further. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you about the metal box in the laundry room and the bank account and the flight to Denver, and the morning at Coastal Heritage Bank when everything came back around, I want to stop and ask you something. Where are you right now? What city are you in? What state? What part of this country? Put it in the comments, because I genuinely want to know who is out here listening to an old man tell the hardest story he has ever told out loud. And if it is late where you are, if it is the kind of night where you cannot explain why you are awake, but you are, I understand that feeling better than you might imagine. Leave a like if any of this is already sitting somewhere real in your chest. Subscribe, because there is a new story here every single day. And let me get back to that kitchen. Let me get back to Derek on the phone and those 2 words I said that I meant in a way I could not have explained to you right then. Derek kept talking. He had reasons. He always has reasons. Derek is 34 years old, and he works as a junior real estate consultant, which means he has spent the better part of a decade learning the language of property and value and market conditions, and somewhere along the way he started applying that language to everything, including to me. He said the house was old. He said the market in Savannah was strong right now, and it would be irresponsible not to take advantage. He said I did not need all that space for one person. He said Marissa's mother, Patricia, had agreed to let me use the back room at her property in Pooler for a while, just until things settled, and that Patricia was very kind for offering. I listened. I did not interrupt. The fan turned. He said it was better for everyone. He said I would see that in time. He said it was complicated to explain over the phone, but that he and Marissa had thought about it carefully, and they were confident this was the right move. He said it like a man presenting a business case. He said it like someone who had rehearsed it. He said it like someone who had been waiting for the right moment to say it and had decided Thursday evening was close enough. When he was done, I said, "I appreciate you calling to let me know." He said he would be in touch about logistics. I said good night. I put the phone down on the table next to the cold coffee, and I sat there and I let the fan do its thinking for me for a while because I was not capable of thinking on my own just yet. I want to tell you something about that house before I tell you what I did next. I want to tell you about it. Not to make you feel sorry for me, but because you need to understand what it was before you can understand what happened. The house on East Bolden Street is not a remarkable house by any standard measure. It is not large. It is not grand. It has 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window that faces east, a small back porch that catches the afternoon shade, and a front porch with 2 wooden chairs that I painted sage green 7 years ago because the original white was peeling, and I had some paint left over from the porch rails. I bought this house 27 years ago after the divorce from Elaine. I bought it with money I had saved working maintenance at the port, managing systems, supervising repair schedules, spending the kind of hours that do not always translate into anything you can explain at a dinner party, but that keep things running. I bought it because Derek was 9 years old, and I wanted him to have a place to come to that was mine, that was stable, that was somewhere between where he started and wherever he was going to end up. I replaced the roof in the spring of the year Derek turned 15. I did 90% of the labor myself and hired 1 roofer for the sections I could not safely reach alone. I replaced every window seal in the 2nd bedroom when Derek was in college because water was getting in around the frames and I did not want to lose the wall. I refinished the floors twice, the first time badly and the second time properly. I rebuilt the back porch steps when the second one cracked through. I repaired the front gate. I replanted the side garden after a bad season killed everything. I painted the exterior 3 times. I fixed the ceiling fan in the living room, the garbage disposal, the water heater when it started leaking at the base, and the slow drain in the hall bathroom that had been irritating me for a year before I finally got under the vanity on a Tuesday afternoon and fixed it myself. I paid the mortgage every month for 22 years. Not once late, not once short. And on a Thursday night in October, I sat at the kitchen table in that house and listened to my son explain why he had sold it. I want to be careful here about something. I want to be honest with you about what I felt sitting there, because I think the honesty matters more than the drama. What I felt was not rage. I have felt rage in my life, real rage, the kind that comes from injustice and exhaustion, and the particular humiliation of being dismissed by someone who should know better. This was not that. What I felt was something quieter and in some ways more complete. It was the feeling of a floor disappearing under your feet when you were not expecting it, not a fall, just the sudden and total absence of what you had assumed would be there. And underneath that, underneath the absence, was something else, something old and patient and very clear. I got up from the table. I put the coffee cup in the sink. I walked to the laundry room at the back of the house, the small one off the kitchen that smells like detergent and old wood, and I opened the cabinet above the utility sink, the one with the bifold door that sticks slightly in humid weather and requires you to lift and pull at the same time. I moved a can of wood stain and a box of spare switch plates, and I reached to the back left corner where the shelf meets the wall, and I took out the metal box. It is a green metal box, the kind that used to be sold in hardware stores as a document safe, about the size of a large hardback book, with a combination lock that I have opened so many times over the years that my fingers find the numbers without my mind having to direct them. I carried it to the kitchen table and I sat down and I opened it. The box contains the following things: the original deed to the house, signed in my name, dated 27 years ago. Every mortgage payment receipt, organized by year in rubber-banded stacks. The receipts for every major repair and improvement, kept because the port taught me that documentation is not paranoia but professionalism. A folder of correspondence with the bank, including the original loan agreement and 2 refinancing documents from years when interest rates made it advantageous. 3 letters from Derek, written when he was in college. The kind of letters a young man writes to his father when he is far from home and uncertain and has not yet learned to be careful with his words. I keep those letters in the box, not because I need them for any practical purpose, but because they are the Derek I still believe is in there somewhere, the one who was 20 years old and a little bit scared and honest about it. And at the bottom of the box, underneath the deed and the mortgage receipts and the repair logs, a document I had almost forgotten about. A limited authorization form, signed by me, witnessed and notarized, granting Derek Monroe the authority to communicate with Coastal Heritage Bank on my behalf regarding a potential home equity line of credit inquiry. I had signed that form 4 months earlier. Derek had come to me in June with a plan. He said he wanted to help me access some equity in the house, to cover some expenses, maybe do some deferred maintenance, get ahead of things. He framed it as concern. He said the bank would need someone to speak on my behalf for certain communications, and that a limited authorization would make the process smoother. He brought the form already prepared. I read it. It said limited authorization for inquiry and discussion purposes. It said it did not constitute transfer authority or sale authority. I signed it because he was my son and I believed he was trying to help me. And I had no reason not to. Sitting at the kitchen table at 9:15 on a Thursday night in October, reading that document again in the light above the stove, I understood what he had done with it. He had used it not for its stated purpose, but to establish a presence with the bank, to build conversations with people there, to create a context in which he appeared to have a role in my financial affairs. He had used it to reach brokers. He had used it to begin a process that had no authorization, and he had done it gradually enough and quietly enough that by the time he called me on a Thursday evening to tell me the house was sold, he had been building the architecture of that call for months. I sat with that for a while. The fan turned. The jasmine moved in from the window, and then I opened my laptop, and I logged into my account at Coastal Heritage Bank, and I looked at the balance on the old home equity line I had taken out 13 years ago for the roof, a small remaining balance that I had been carrying at a low interest rate because there was no urgency to pay it, and I moved $38,740.16 from my savings account to pay it off in full. The transaction went through in 4 minutes. The balance on the equity line became zero. The house was now fully, completely, unambiguously mine, without any debt attached to it that could be used as a justification for a forced or encouraged sale, without any financial argument that a son could make to a bank about restructuring or protecting or reorganizing his father's affairs. The house was mine, the way a thing is yours, when you have paid every cent of what you ever owed on it and the paper in your hand says so. Then I opened a travel site, and I bought a one-way ticket from Savannah to Denver, Colorado, departing at 6:50 in the morning. Then I went to bed. I did not sleep well, but I went to bed. And in the morning I packed one small bag. I want to tell you about Graham before I tell you about the morning I left. My brother Graham Monroe is 61 years old, and he lives in Denver on South Pearl Street in a house that he has owned for 19 years. And that looks, from the outside, like a man who made decisions slowly and kept them. Graham is not a complicated person. He works with his hands, always has, built a small business repairing and restoring furniture and cabinetry that has served him well enough for a long time. He is not a man who gives speeches. He is not a man who offers advice unless you ask for it. He is the kind of man who, when his brother calls him at 10:45 at night and says he needs a place to land for a while, says, "All right. Come, the guest room's clear." That is all he said, and that is all I needed. I packed the small bag. I took the metal box with the documents. I took the house key, the original brass one from 27 years ago, worn smooth along the bow from so many mornings of locking and unlocking the front door. I took a photograph from the hallway, the one of Derek at 12 years old on the back porch of this house, eating a piece of watermelon and squinting into the afternoon sun, because the light was strong and he was happy. And he did not know yet how complicated happiness was going to get. I did not take much else. A man of 56 who has spent 27 years building something knows what is essential and what is furniture. I left the house on East Bolton Street at 4:50 in the morning, while Savannah was still dark and still and smelling of salt water and jasmine and the particular sweetness of a southern October night that has not yet decided to become morning. I drove to the airport. I parked the car in long-term parking. I walked to the terminal. And in the terminal, while I waited at the gate, my phone vibrated with a voice message from Marissa. I listened to the message once. Marissa's voice is always precise. Controlled. She speaks the way she dresses, which is to say without a wasted element, without anything that does not serve a purpose, without warmth that is not strategic. She said that she knew this was an adjustment, but that the room at her mother's was actually quite nice and had its own entrance, and that a lot of people my age would be grateful to have a situation like this one arranged for them. She said her mother Patricia was very accommodating and that I should not feel like a burden because, and here she paused slightly in a way that I recognized as a person choosing words very carefully, they wanted me to be comfortable. She said I should let Derek know when I was ready to discuss the logistics of moving my belongings. She said she hoped I would see, in time, that this was the right decision for the whole family. She used the phrase, the whole family. I put the phone in my jacket pocket and looked out the terminal window at the dark tarmac and the lights of the runway and the particular orange and purple that Savannah's sky does before the sun comes all the way up, the color that used to make Elaine stop whatever she was doing when we were married, and just stand in front of a window for a minute, because she said that color did not last long enough, and you had to pay attention to things that did not last long enough. Elaine and I have been divorced for 29 years. We were young and not suited, and the divorce was not easy, but it was honest, and we managed something afterward that I would not call friendship exactly, but that I would call a decent mutual respect. She raised Derek in the early years. I had him summers and alternating holidays. We managed the way two people manage when they have made a mistake together and are willing to carry their half of the correction with some dignity. She remarried years ago, lives in Charleston now. And we speak occasionally in the way of people who share a child, and have found a way to do so without animosity. Derek grew up between two houses, and I think that does something to a person. I do not say this as an excuse, I say it as an observation. A child who grows up between two houses learns very early that home is not a fixed thing, but a negotiated one, that belonging is not automatic but conditional, that the stability you feel in one place can be revoked, and you will be moved to another, and you will be expected to adjust. I think Derek learned those lessons well. Too well. I think he learned them so well that he forgot there were people for whom home is not negotiable, and belonging is not conditional, and stability is not something you revoke without consequence. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you who Derek was before I tell you who he became. Derek Monroe at 12 years old was the boy in the photograph I took from the hallway. He was a boy who asked questions about everything, who wanted to know how the port operated, who sat next to me on weekends when I was doing repairs and handed me tools and asked what each one was for and why. He was a boy who was not afraid to be wrong about things and who corrected himself openly when he was. He was a boy who called me on Sunday evenings from his mother's house, not because he needed anything, but because he wanted to talk, and those conversations were sometimes about nothing and sometimes about everything, and I treasured every one of them in a way I never said out loud, because I was not then a man who said things like that out loud. He was also, even at 12, a boy who cared very much about what other people thought of him. Not in the way all children care, but in a more specific way, a way that made him watch rooms when he entered them, that made him calibrate his behavior to the visible expectations around him, that made him uncomfortable when he could not read what was wanted. I noticed it and thought it was something he would grow out of. Some things you grow out of. Some things grow with you. He went to college in Georgia and did well enough. He had a business inclination that I respected even when I did not fully share it. He came home summers and worked a couple of those summers with me at the port, not in any skilled capacity, but helping with basic tasks, and I valued those summers for the time they were. He graduated and moved around, worked in Atlanta for a few years, came back to Savannah because the real estate market was pulling people who knew how to talk to clients, and Derek had always known how to talk to clients. He met Marissa when he was 28. I met Marissa at a dinner Derek arranged about 6 weeks into their relationship. She wore something expensive and said all the right things and looked at Derek with an expression I recognized as a woman who had found something she wanted and was not planning to let it go. I do not say that as a criticism. I say it as an observation from a man who has spent 56 years reading rooms. She was intelligent and organized and had a clarity of purpose that was impressive and a little cold. She was kind to me that evening in the particular way of someone who has decided to be kind as a strategy. I told Derek after dinner that I thought she was impressive. I did not tell him the other thing I thought, which was that I was not sure she saw the people around her as full people rather than as variables in an equation she was always solving. I did not say it because he was 28 and in love, and the only thing that telling him that would have accomplished was to make him angry at me and protective of her, and I was not certain enough in my reading to cause that damage, so I kept it to myself. I filed it in the place where I keep things I am not ready to act on. They married 2 years later. I attended the wedding on Tybee Island on a September afternoon when the light on the water was extraordinary and Derek looked genuinely happy in a way that reminded me of the 12-year-old boy and made me hope I was wrong about everything I had noticed. The reception was at a venue on the island and the food was good and the speeches were short, and I danced badly with a woman from Marissa's side of the family who was gracious about it. The years after the wedding were cordial, holiday dinners, occasional Sunday lunches when they were nearby. Derek called less frequently than he had before the marriage, but this is ordinary and I did not read anything into it. When he called, the conversations were shorter and more purposeful, more about information exchange than about talking. But again, I told myself this was simply adulthood and marriage and a busy life and not something to assign meaning to. The first time I noticed something specific was about 14 months after the wedding. I had a week in the hospital, nothing catastrophic. A cardiac event that turned out to be less serious than the initial presentation suggested, but serious enough to require monitoring, a procedure, and several days of observation. I called Derek from the hospital and he came the second day. He was there for 2 hours. Marissa came briefly the third day, stayed 40 minutes, and said something about a work commitment she could not move. The nurses and the doctors were kind. A man from my church, whom I have known for many years, Reverend Thomas, came and sat with me for an afternoon, and we talked about nothing important, and it was one of the best afternoons I can remember from that period. On the fourth day, lying in a hospital bed with the particular clarity that comes from having been frightened and then relieved, I understood something. Derek had come. He had checked the box. He had been present in the way a person is present when presence is expected of them. And then he had gone back to his life, and the frequency of his calls in the weeks that followed was no greater than it had been before. I want to tell you something about that realization. I want to be honest with you because I think the honesty is why you are still listening. That realization did not make me angry at Derek. It made me sad for something I could not name precisely. Something like the gap between the love you have for someone and the love they are capable of returning in a given moment. I had given Derek a love without conditions and without measurement, and the hospital showed me that what came back was a love with a schedule and a checklist and a limit. That is not nothing. That is something, but it is not the same thing. I mention this not because the hospital is central to the story, but because it is the first moment when I began to understand the shape of what was coming. Understanding does not always arrive all at once. Sometimes it arrives the way water works on stone, slowly, invisibly, over a long time, and then one day you notice the stone has changed, and you cannot say when exactly it changed, but you know that it has. Now I need to tell you something about the authorization form. I need to tell you exactly what happened in June, and exactly why I signed it, and exactly what I understood and did not understand in that moment. Derek came to the house on a Saturday morning in June, which was already slightly unusual, because our visits were typically arranged in advance, and this one was not. He called me the evening before and said he wanted to come by and talk through some financial planning ideas he had been thinking about. I said of course. I made coffee. He arrived at 9:15. He seemed organized and slightly nervous in a way that he covered with efficiency. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table, and he opened his laptop and showed me some numbers. He showed me the current estimated value of the house, which was considerably higher than I would have guessed because of how Savannah's market had moved in recent years. He showed me the remaining balance on the old home equity line, the one I had taken out 13 years ago for the roof. He showed me some calculations about monthly expenses and what he called financial optimization for someone at my stage of life. He said he had been thinking about my long-term security. He said he wanted to make sure I was set up properly. He said that the equity in the house was a significant asset that was essentially sitting dormant, and that there were strategies for accessing that equity in ways that could benefit me considerably. I asked him what kind of strategies. He said he wanted to start by having a conversation with the bank to understand my options. He said the bank would want to speak with someone who had authorization to discuss my accounts in an informational capacity. He said it was very standard. He said it did not give him any authority over anything, just the ability to have conversations on my behalf. He had the form with him, already prepared, already filled in with my name and the bank name and the authorization language. I read it. It said limited authorization for inquiry and discussion purposes relating to home equity and credit line options. It specified that this authorization did not constitute authority to execute transactions, authorize sales, or act in lieu of the account holder for any binding financial decisions. I signed it. I want to be very clear with you about why I signed it. I signed it because I trusted my son. Not because I was confused. Not because I did not read it. Not because I was old and dim and could not follow the language. I was not any of those things. I signed it because I was a father who believed his son was sitting at his kitchen table on a Saturday morning because he cared about his father's financial future. I signed it because the document said what it said, and I had no reason to believe the document would be used for anything other than what it said. I signed it because love and trust are sometimes the same thing, and sometimes they are a vulnerability, and you cannot always know which you are carrying until it costs you something. I am going to need you to stay with me here for a second, because what I just told you is the part of this story that I think about the most. Not what Derek did with that authorization, what I did in signing it, the trust I extended, the belief I had in my son at 9:15 on a Saturday morning over coffee at the kitchen table. I refinished myself 11 years ago. Where are you watching from right now? What city? What state? Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. And what time is it where you are? I want to know if you are in the middle of your morning or the end of your night, because I think this story hits differently depending on when you are finding it. If someone you love has ever made you feel like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known, leave a comment. You do not have to say much. Just tell me you are out there. Hit the like button. Subscribe for daily stories. And let me keep going, because what happened next with Derek and that authorization is something I have needed to say out loud for a long time. What Derek did with the authorization over the following 4 months was this. He used it to have conversations with Howard Ellison, the branch manager at Coastal Heritage Bank on West Broughton Street, a man I have done business with for many years and who knows my face and my account history, and who, in the presence of my son presenting a limited authorization, had no reason to believe those conversations were anything other than what they appeared to be. A son helping his father think through financial options. Derek used those conversations to establish what I would later understand he described as a family consensus around the property. He talked about my stage of life. He talked about my living situation. He talked about the equity in the house. He presented a picture of a concerned son helping an aging father navigate assets that had become, in his framing, more than I needed to manage alone. He also began talking to Nathaniel Brooks, a real estate broker he knew through his consulting work. He had conversations with Nathaniel about the property, about its condition, about its market value, about timing. He described a situation in which the owner of the property was open to options. He did not say the owner had authorized a sale. He created an atmosphere in which a sale seemed to be a natural and agreed-upon development. Marissa was part of this. I do not know exactly when the plan took its full shape, whether it was constructed together or whether Derek brought her the framework and she refined it. But the efficiency of the thing, the attention to logistics, the arrangement with Patricia about the backroom, the way the phone call on Thursday evening was handled as an announcement rather than a conversation, all of that carries her particular quality of organization. Marissa is a woman who does not begin a project she has not already completed in her mind. Patricia Caldwell agreed to offer the back room of her property in Pooler. Patricia is 63 years old and she has a small spare room off the back of her house that she uses for furniture storage. She is not a cruel woman. I do not believe she thought of it as cruelty. I believe she thought of it as a practical solution to what her daughter had described as a situation that required a practical solution. Patricia is a woman who respects pragmatism, and her daughter's pragmatism is something she admires. Whether she thought about what it would mean to a man of 56 to be moved from the house he built to a back room used for furniture storage, I cannot say. The message Marissa left me at the airport gate was, in that context, entirely consistent with her character. She was not gloating. She was managing. She was providing information and framing and the outline of a logistics plan. She said accommodate, and she meant contain. She said grateful, and she meant compliant. She had decided what the situation was, and she was describing it to me in the language of someone who expects their description to become the accepted reality. I had already changed the reality. In Denver, Graham met me at the airport with his truck. He is a big man, Graham, broader than me, with hands that show 40 years of working with wood and metal. He shook my hand at arrivals the way our father shook hands with both hands, the right gripping and the left coming over the top. And he looked at my face the way a man looks at his brother's face when he knows something has happened and is waiting to understand what it is. He did not ask. He picked up the smaller of my 2 bags and walked to the truck. We drove to South Pearl Street in the particular silence of 2 people who have known each other longer than they have known almost anyone else. The city came up around us, Denver in October, the mountains showing at the edges of the streets in a way they do not in Savannah, where the land is flat and the horizon is always water or sky. When we got to the house, he showed me the guest room. It had a window that faced west, and a bed with a blue quilt and a small wooden desk that Graham had made himself from reclaimed oak. The room smelled like sawdust and something clean. He said there was coffee in the kitchen and food in the refrigerator and that he had work in the morning, but that I should sleep and we would talk when I was ready. I sat on the edge of the bed in that guest room in Denver, and I held the metal box in my lap, and I thought about the difference between a room offered freely by a man who owed me nothing and a room offered as a solution by people who believed they were relocating a problem. Graham is my brother. He has his own life, his own complications, his own history that is not part of this story. He is not a man who discusses emotions at length, or who requires you to explain your pain in full before he acknowledges it. He is a man who says, "Come." The guest room is clear, and means by that exactly what he says and nothing less. I thought about Derek on the phone Thursday night, explaining logistics. I thought about Marissa's voice at the airport gate, explaining accommodation. I thought about Patricia's back room, arranged for storage. And I thought about Graham's guest room with the blue quilt, and the desk he made himself, and the window facing the mountains. A man who owes you nothing offers you more than a son who owes you everything. I do not say that to be bitter. I say it because it is true, and because the truth of it is something I needed to sit with in that room in Denver before I could understand what came next. I slept. Not well. But I slept. In the morning, Graham made eggs, and we sat at his kitchen table and drank coffee, and he asked me, in the way he asks things, which is plain and without decoration, "What do you need from me?" I said, "A few days, maybe a week. I have some things in motion." He nodded. He poured more coffee. He said, "All right." That was the whole conversation. I spent 3 days in Denver. I walked in the mornings on South Pearl Street where the trees were already turning and the air was cold in a way Savannah air never quite manages, and the sky was a blue that I found unexpectedly clarifying. I drank coffee at a small place 2 blocks from Graham's house where a man behind the counter did not know me and did not need to know me and brought me a cup without asking questions. I called Howard Ellison at Coastal Heritage Bank from a park bench and had a professional, courteous, entirely clear conversation with him about the current status of my account and the recent payoff of my home equity line. Howard confirmed, in the careful language of a bank manager who understands the situation he is looking at without quite saying so directly, that the property at 914 East Bolton Street was now free and clear of all debt obligations and that the deed remained in my name exclusively, and that any future transactions relating to the property would require my direct and personal authorization. I thanked him. I called my attorney, a woman named Ruth Garner, who has handled my legal affairs for 14 years, and who I reached on her cell phone because she took my call when she recognized my number. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I value most about Ruth. When I was done, she said she wanted me to send her the authorization form I had signed in June, and she would review it and have some thoughts for me within 24 hours. She also said several other things that were useful and that I will tell you about in the right order when the right moment comes. On the third morning in Denver, I woke up before Graham and I sat in his kitchen with the coffee he had set to brew on a timer, the way he always has, and I read the message Derek had left me the previous evening. He had been trying to reach me. He did not know I had gone to Denver. He did not know I had paid off the equity line. He said he wanted to go over the details of the transition, and that Patricia was ready to receive me, and that Marissa had arranged for a moving company to come to East Bolton Street on the following Wednesday. A moving company. On Wednesday. To my house. To remove my belongings. I wrote back to him. I wrote, "I will be in touch soon. There are some things I need to take care of first." He did not respond that night. I imagine he read it and assumed it was the resignation of a man who was processing, who was adjusting, who was doing what had been decided for him and needed a few days to accept the new arrangement. Let me stop here and tell you something directly. Because I have been telling you this story for a while now, and I want to make sure you are still with me and that what I am telling you is landing the way I mean it to. This story is not about revenge. I want to be careful about that word because it is not the right word. Revenge is something you do to someone you hate. What I did in those days in Denver and in the days that followed, the phone call to the bank, the conversation with Ruth, the flight back to Savannah on the morning of the following Monday, I did not do any of it from hatred. I did it from the same place I had always operated from. Dignity. The particular slow dignity of a man who built something real and intended to keep it. Derek is my son. I love him in the way a father loves a son, which is to say completely and without the option of not doing so, and I understand that what he did came from somewhere in him that I probably helped make. Some version of the lessons he learned growing up between two houses and trying to figure out what home meant and how to hold it. Some version of the insecurity that Marissa's ambition found and decided to use. Some version of a son who looked at his father's house and saw an asset instead of a life, and could not, in that moment, find his way back to the difference. I understand all of that. I hold all of that. And I went back to Savannah on Monday morning carrying all of it and carrying also the metal box and the brass key and the photograph of the 12-year-old boy squinting into the afternoon sun. I had a conversation to be part of. Where are you right now? What state? What city? Drop it in the comments. And if you have ever had to fly somewhere quietly because staying would have required you to be someone you were not, tell me about it below. One sentence, just one. Hit the like button if this story is sitting with you. Subscribe because there is something new here every single day. And let me tell you about the Monday morning when I walked back into Savannah. Let me tell you about the walk into Coastal Heritage Bank. Let me tell you about Howard Ellison looking at his screen and the silence that followed and the particular expression on Marissa's face when she understood, in a conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air, what my two quiet words on a Thursday night had actually meant. Because that part is coming, and that is when everything changed. The flight back was direct. I landed in Savannah before noon. The air at the airport was warm and salt-touched and smelled like home in a way Denver's air, much as I had appreciated its clarity, did not. I picked up my car from long-term parking, paid the fee, and drove to East Bolton Street and parked in front of the house and sat for a moment. The sage-green chairs on the front porch, the jasmine along the fence, the window facing east. The slight unevenness of the front walk where a tree root had lifted one of the pavers 2 autumns ago, and I had reset it but not quite perfectly. I was home. I went inside and I made a fresh pot of coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I called Ruth Garner, and we went over everything we had discussed in Denver and some additional things she had identified in her review of the authorization form and the timeline of Derek's actions. Ruth is a precise woman and a thorough one, and by the end of that call, I understood exactly what was going to happen on Monday morning at Coastal Heritage Bank and exactly what would not happen. I also sent one message. To Derek, I said, "I am back in Savannah. I will meet you at the bank Monday morning." He wrote back within minutes. He said he would let Marissa and the broker know. He seemed to read my message as capitulation, as the practical old man finally coming around to handle the paperwork on the thing that had already been decided. I can understand that reading. It was a reasonable reading given everything he thought he knew. It was also completely wrong. Monday morning came in Savannah the way October mornings come, with a coolness that arrived overnight and lingered into the early hours before the day warmed up. I put on a jacket that I have had for many years, a navy one that Elaine gave me for a birthday long before the divorce, that I keep because it fits well and because I am not sentimental about many things, but I am sentimental about a well-fitting jacket. I drove to West Broughton Street. I parked. I walked into the bank. Howard Ellison's assistant showed me to a seat near the window. I sat down. I waited. Derek arrived first. He came in with the particular walk of a man who is managing his nerves with confidence, the slightly too deliberate pace, the direct eye contact, the expression that is performing ease. He saw me and something moved across his face very quickly, surprise and then a recalibration, and then the performance of ease again. He said, "Hello, Dad." I said, "Good morning, Derek." He sat down across from me and did not say anything else, because there was not, in that moment, anything adequate to say. Marissa arrived 2 minutes later with Patricia and Nathaniel Brooks. Marissa was dressed precisely. Patricia looked slightly uncertain, in a way she was suppressing. Nathaniel had his briefcase and the practiced calm of a professional who has attended many signings and expects this one to be routine. They arranged themselves. A bank employee brought water. Howard came out of his office and greeted everyone, and they moved into the conference room. I walked into the conference room and took a seat. The room smelled like carpet and recycled air, and the particular cleanliness of a professional space in a regional bank that takes itself seriously. Howard sat at the head of the table. Derek was to his left, Marissa to Derek's left, Patricia next to Marissa, Nathaniel across from Derek. I sat to Howard's right. Howard opened the folder in front of him. He looked at his screen for several seconds. He looked at it longer than the situation seemed to require, and I watched Derek watch Howard, and I watched the first small shift in Derek's expression. Not alarm yet, just attention. And then Howard said what he said. He said it professionally and without drama, which is the correct way to say something of this weight. He said the sale could not proceed in the terms as presented. He said the home equity line of credit tied to the property had been paid off in full by the account holder on the evening of the previous Thursday. He said the deed to the property at 914 East Bolton Street was held exclusively in the name of Caleb Monroe, and that any sale of the property would require his direct and personal presence and authorization and consent. He said the limited authorization on file had never granted any party the authority to engage in sale negotiations on behalf of the account holder. He looked at Derek as he said this last part, briefly, professionally, and then he looked at his folder again, and then he said, "Mr. Monroe did not lose his house. He paid it off." There is a particular kind of silence that lives in a house when the person inside it has just understood something that cannot be undone. Not the silence of emptiness. Not the silence of peace. Something older and heavier than either of those. The silence of a man sitting very still while the world he thought he understood arranges itself into a shape he was not prepared to see. I sat at the kitchen table in the house on East Bolton Street for a long time after I came back from Denver. The coffee I had made was cold again. I had not drunk it. The light above the stove was the only light on in the house, and it cast everything in that particular yellow that late-night kitchens have. The color of things being honest with themselves because no one is watching. I had the metal box open in front of me, not because I needed to look at the documents again, I had read them enough times by now that they were part of me. But the box being open meant the information was out in the air rather than sealed inside, and somehow that felt important. Somehow that felt like the difference between carrying something alone in the dark and letting it exist in the open, where it could be looked at clearly. I thought about Derek. I thought about the Derek who was 12 years old and sat on the back porch of this house eating watermelon in the afternoon sun, squinting because the light was strong, and happy in the uncomplicated way that a 12-year-old boy is happy when he is eating something good on a summer afternoon with nowhere particular to be. I thought about the Derek who called me every Sunday evening from his mother's house in those years, not because he needed anything but because he wanted to talk, and those conversations went everywhere and nowhere, and I would hang up afterward and sit in whatever room I was in and feel the particular richness of knowing that my son wanted to call me, just to talk. I thought about the Derek who came to my hospital room when I had the cardiac event and who sat with me for 2 hours, and who looked during those 2 hours, both present and somehow already somewhere else in his mind, a man managing 2 places at once, the room he was physically in and the life he needed to get back to. And I thought about the Derek who called me on a Thursday evening and said, "Dad, we sold your house. You'll stay in the back room at Marissa's mother's place until we figure things out." I am going to tell you something about love that took me 56 years and the worst Thursday of my adult life to understand fully. Love is not the same thing as permission. I had spent 27 years loving Derek with a love that had no bottom and no edges, a love that said, "Whatever you need, whatever you are, whatever you become, you are my son, and I am your father, and nothing changes that." And that love was real, and it is still real, and it will be real when I am gone from this earth. But somewhere in the teaching of that love, I had confused unconditional love with unconditional permission. I had let my love for Derek mean that I could be treated in any way, and I would absorb it because I loved him. I had let my love be a door that opened in only one direction. That is not love. That is a room with no lock that anyone can walk into whenever they choose. I thought about that for a long time at the kitchen table. The fan turned overhead. The jasmine was gone from the window now. It was later in the season, but the smell of it was still in the memory of the room. Ruth Garner had told me something during our last conversation that I kept returning to. She said that the hardest cases she worked were not the ones where bad strangers did bad things. They were the ones where people who genuinely loved each other had allowed things to become badly wrong because no one had drawn a line early enough. She said she had seen more pain caused by the absence of limits than by the presence of malice. She said that sometimes the most loving thing a person could do for the people they cared about was to draw a line clearly and hold it absolutely. Not out of anger, not as punishment, because the line itself was an act of respect for both people. I had not drawn a line. I was drawing one now. I got up from the table and I washed the cold coffee down the sink and I made a fresh cup, and I took it to the front porch and sat in one of the sage-green chairs, and I looked at East Bolton Street in the dark. The street was quiet the way Savannah streets get quiet late at night, not an absence of life, but a settling of it, the neighborhood breathing slowly, the live oaks perfectly still in the air that was just beginning to turn cool enough to notice. Down the block a porch light was on. Somewhere further away a car passed. The city moved in its slow nighttime way, and I sat in the chair that I had painted sage green 7 years ago. And I held the coffee cup in both hands, and I thought about what came next, because there was a what came next. I had paid off the equity line, I had gone to Denver, I had talked to Ruth, I had let the information settle into something organized and clear. And now there was a what came next that involved the week ahead and the bank on West Broughton Street and the people who were going to walk into that bank on Monday morning believing they had already won. They had not won. I want to pause here and check in with you, because I know this part of the story, this quiet middle part, the part between the lowest point and the beginning of things turning. This is the part where some people think nothing is happening. But I want you to understand that this is where everything was happening. Just quietly, just in a kitchen, just on a front porch, on East Bolton Street at midnight, with a cup of coffee. Before I go any further, tell me where you are watching from right now. Your city, your state. Drop it in the comments, because I genuinely read every single one, and I want to know who is out there in the middle of this story with me. And what time is it where you are? Are you in the morning? Are you in the night? Are you somewhere in the middle of a day that needed a story like this one? Tell me. Leave a like if you are still with me. Subscribe, because there is a new story here every single day, and I think you are going to want to stay for what happens at that bank. Now, let me keep going. The days between my return from Denver and the Monday morning at the bank were 5 days of the most disciplined and deliberate work I have ever done in my life, and I want to tell you what that work looked like, because I think it matters. It is easy to picture the father in a story like this as someone who has a secret weapon and a plan and who executes everything flawlessly from a position of power. That is not what the inside of those 5 days felt like. The inside of those 5 days felt like a man holding something very fragile and very important in hands that were not always steady, moving carefully, checking each step twice, trying to do something consequential without breaking anything that could not be repaired. The first thing I did was meet with Ruth in person. Ruth Garner's office is on Drayton Street, a small professional suite in a building that is older than most of the people who work in it, with a waiting area that smells like old wood and the kind of carpet that absorbs the weight of difficult conversations. I have been in that office many times over 14 years, for things ordinary and things not. Ruth is 53 years old, a small woman with the particular stillness of someone who has spent decades sitting across from people in crisis and has learned that stillness is the most useful thing she can offer them. She had reviewed the authorization form and the timeline I had given her over the phone. She had some additional questions, and she had some information I had not known. The authorization form I signed in June was, as I had understood, a limited authorization. It specified clearly that it did not constitute sale authority. But Ruth had found something in the fine print of how Derek had presented the form to the bank that was more problematic than the form itself. Derek had represented to Howard Ellison that the limited authorization was part of a broader family agreement. He had not forged any document. He had not made any explicitly false statement, but he had created, through implication and suggestion, the impression that the family had reached a consensus about the future of the property, and that the authorization was one piece of a larger agreed-upon process. Howard, as a professional doing his job in good faith, had received that impression and had factored it into his handling of subsequent conversations with Derek. This was not criminal. Ruth was clear about that. Derek had not committed fraud in any technical legal sense. He had been misleading. He had operated at the edges of what the authorization actually permitted. He had been, in Ruth's precise language, significantly out of bounds. But here is what she also told me. None of it mattered now from a practical standpoint. Because the equity line was paid, the deed was clean, the authorization was limited, and had been used outside its scope in a way that Howard was now fully aware of. The sale could not proceed without my direct presence and consent, and my direct presence and consent were not going to be given. What Monday morning at the bank was going to be, Ruth told me, was a clarification. A professional, documented, legally clear clarification that restored the record to its accurate state and created a formal understanding between all parties about the actual status of the property. She also told me that if Derek or Marissa attempted to proceed with any sale action after Monday's meeting, she would have very specific and very effective responses available. She said this the way she says everything, without drama and without empty threat. She just laid out what the landscape would look like and let me understand it. I left Ruth's office on Thursday afternoon, and I walked to my car, and I sat for a few minutes before driving. The sky above Drayton Street was the particular blue of a Georgia October afternoon, when the humidity has finally begun to ease and the light has a clarity to it that summer does not allow. I sat in the car, and I felt something that I want to try to describe accurately. It was not triumph. That was not the right word. It was closer to what I imagine a man feels when he has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and someone finally tells him, You can set it down now. Not because the problem is solved, not because everything is going to be easy from here, but because the weight no longer needs to be carried alone and in secret. Because the thing has a shape now and a position, and other people know what it is. I drove home. I made dinner. A simple thing, the kind of meal I make for myself on weeknights, something that required enough attention to occupy my hands without requiring enough thought to distract me from what I was processing. I ate at the kitchen table. I washed the dishes. I went to the workshop. The workshop is in the small outbuilding at the back of the property, a structure that was a garage when I bought the house, and that I converted over the years into the space where I do the work I have always done with my hands. Woodworking mostly, small furniture repairs, the occasional project that is not useful but that requires the kind of attention that empties a mind of everything except what is in front of it. I go to the workshop the way other men go to the porch or the garden or the fishing hole. It is where I think without thinking. It is where problems solve themselves while my hands are doing something else. That Thursday evening I was not working on any specific project. I was just moving through the space, running my hands along the bench, checking the sharpness of tools I had already checked the week before, smelling the sawdust and the oil and the particular smell of that space that belongs to no other place on earth. I thought about Graham. I thought about what he had given me by saying, "Come, the guest room is clear. No questions, no conditions, no performance of concern. Just come." And I thought about the difference between that and the back room at Patricia Caldwell's property in Pooler, with its furniture storage and its practical offer of space that was not an offer of care but an offer of containment. I thought about my father, who had been dead for 11 years, who had built things with his hands the way I build things with mine, who had told me once when I was about Derek's current age, "A man who builds things knows the difference between a thing that was built to last and a thing that was built to look like it will last. That difference shows up eventually. It always shows up. You just have to be patient enough to wait for it." I had been patient enough. The Friday before the Monday meeting, I received a message from Derek. He said he had been trying to reach me. He said he knew I was probably processing everything and that he respected that. He said he and Marissa had spoken with Patricia and that the room in Pooler was ready and that the moving company was scheduled for Wednesday and that he was hoping we could get on the same page before then. He said he hoped I understood that this was not easy for any of them either, and that they were trying to do right by me. I read that message 3 times. The phrase, "trying to do right by me," is the kind of phrase that a person uses when they have already done something wrong and are hoping the language of good intention will paper over the evidence of bad action. It is a phrase that positions the speaker as generous and the recipient as someone in need of being done right by. It assumes a posture of beneficence that requires the other person to be in a position of dependence. Derek was 34 years old and trying to do right by his 56-year-old father. His 56-year-old father, who had worked for 30 years, raised him, maintained a house for 27 years, paid off a mortgage, and was now being offered a room in a furniture storage space in Pooler, while his son and daughter-in-law planned to use the proceeds of the sale of his house to put a down payment on a property in the Landings. I wrote back to Derek. I said, "I will be at the bank Monday morning. We can talk then." He sent back a brief reply that said he would let everyone know. There was a quality to the brevity of that reply that told me he was reading my composure as resignation and my willingness to appear at the bank as capitulation. He was picturing Monday morning as a formality. The old man coming in to sign the papers. The process finally moving forward the way it had been planned. I put the phone down. Saturday morning came in Savannah with a light mist that the live oaks held in their canopies, the moisture catching in the Spanish moss, the street wet and quiet and silver at 7 in the morning. I made coffee. I sat on the front porch. I drank the coffee while the city woke up slowly around me, and the light moved from silver to gold as the mist burned off. I thought about something Elaine told me once, years after the divorce, when we had reached the place where we could speak honestly without the weight of failure making everything uncomfortable. She said that the thing she had always admired about me was that I never made noise when I was angry. She said she had known other men who made a lot of noise, who announced their anger, who let their anger be the first thing in the room. She said she had found, over the years, that the men who made the least noise were the ones who were most certain about what they were going to do. She was right about that. She was right about several things, Elaine. I did not make noise. On Sunday I went to church, as I do every Sunday. The service at First Baptist on Chippewa Square is at 10:30, and I have attended it for most of the years I have lived in Savannah. Not consistently in my younger years when work schedules made Sunday mornings complicated, but consistently for a long time now. The Reverend Thomas has known me for many years, and he and I have had many conversations in the small office off the sanctuary where he keeps his desk and his books, and the particular smell of a life spent in service to something larger than individual comfort. After the service, Reverend Thomas asked me how I was doing. I am not a man who discusses my personal affairs broadly, but he and I have a different arrangement. He asked me how I was doing, and I told him honestly that I was in the middle of something difficult and that I expected it to be resolved one way or another before the end of the week. He nodded. He said he would keep me in his prayers, which from him is not a formality but a statement of intention. I thanked him. I went home. Sunday afternoon I spent in the workshop, not because I had work to do, but because the workshop was where I needed to be. I rebuilt a chair joint that had been loose for several months, a Windsor chair that had been in the house since I bought it, and that I had been meaning to attend to. I took the joint apart and cleaned it and re-glued it and clamped it and set it to cure. The work was slow and required attention, and for the hours I was doing it, the hours passed without the particular weight they had carried all week. Sunday evening I sat at the kitchen table one more time, and I went through every document in the metal box in the order I intended to present things on Monday morning. The deed, the payoff confirmation from the bank, the mortgage payment records, the authorization form, and the specific language of its limitations. The timeline Ruth had helped me construct. The letter she had drafted on my behalf that would be delivered to Howard Ellison before the meeting began. I put everything back in the box in the right order. I went to bed at 9:30. I slept better than I had slept in weeks. In the morning I woke at 5:45 without an alarm, as I always do, and I made coffee, and I showered, and I put on the navy jacket, and I sat at the kitchen table one more time, and I drank the coffee while it was still hot. Before I left the house, I stood in the front hallway for a moment. The photograph of Derek at 12 was back on the wall where it belonged. I looked at it. The afternoon sun. The watermelon, the squinting happiness of a boy who had not yet learned to be careful. I said something out loud in the empty hallway. I'm not going to tell you exactly what I said, because some things belong only to the moment they happen in, but it was something to the boy in the photograph, something between a father and a son that did not need anyone else to witness it. I picked up the metal box. I picked up my keys. I locked the front door of my house, and I drove to Coastal Heritage Bank on West Broughton Street. Howard Ellison had received Ruth's letter first thing in the morning. I had arranged for it to be delivered by courier on Sunday evening, so that it would be waiting for him when he arrived. The letter was professional and clear, and laid out the current legal and financial status of the property in terms that left no room for alternative interpretation. It also outlined the scope of the limited authorization and the specific ways in which it had been exceeded, documented through the correspondence Ruth had obtained and reviewed. Howard was a professional man who took his responsibilities seriously. He had been managing this bank branch for many years, and he had relationships with the people in his community that he valued and that he was careful to protect. He had acted in good faith based on the impression Derek had created. He was not happy about that impression now. When I walked into the bank at 8:45, 15 minutes before the meeting was scheduled to begin, Howard met me at the door of his office and shook my hand and said, "I appreciate you coming in, Mr. Monroe. I want you to know I read the letter from your attorney carefully, and I have a clear picture of where things stand." He said it quietly, professionally, and with the particular expression of a man who had spent the weekend thinking about something he did not enjoy thinking about. I said, "I appreciate your handling of this, Howard." He showed me to the conference room. I sat down. I put the metal box on the table in front of me, and I waited for everyone else to arrive. Derek came in first. He had the look of a man who had dressed carefully, who had prepared talking points, who was managing his nerves with the appearance of confidence. He saw me at the table, and something moved across his face very quickly. A small, uncertain thing that was gone before he could decide whether to show it. He said, "Dad, good to see you." I said, "Derek." He sat down. He opened his briefcase. He did not look at me again. Marissa arrived with Patricia and Nathaniel Brooks. Marissa had the controlled precision of a woman who had rehearsed this morning in her mind many times and was executing the plan. Patricia looked slightly uncomfortable in a way she was working to suppress. Nathaniel had his briefcase and his professional ease and his folder of documents. They arranged themselves around the table. Howard came in and took his seat at the head of the table. He had a folder in front of him. He opened it. He looked at his screen for several seconds. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the building's air system and the distant sound of the bank's main floor operating. What happened next, I have already told you. Howard's voice, the information delivered with professional precision. The mortgage paid off. The deed exclusively in my name. The authorization limited and exceeded. The sale unable to proceed as presented. But what I have not told you is what happened in the room in the moments after Howard finished speaking. Derek went very still. It was not the stillness of shock exactly. It was the stillness of a man whose mind is running very fast through a series of calculations and is not yet finding an exit. His hands were on the table in front of him, and they were very still, and his face was doing something that he was trying to control and not entirely succeeding. Marissa was faster. Her response was immediate, and it was the response of someone who had anticipated resistance and had a counter prepared. She said, "Howard, I think there may be some confusion about the authorization that Derek obtained. We can clarify the scope of what was agreed." Her voice was smooth. Her posture was composed. She was executing the next position in the plan. Howard looked at her with the particular professional neutrality of a man who knows exactly what the situation is and is not going to be moved by smooth presentation. He said, "Mrs. Monroe, I have reviewed the authorization document in detail, along with correspondence from Mr. Monroe's attorney. The authorization scope is unambiguous. It was a limited authorization for inquiry purposes only. It did not extend to sale facilitation or any binding financial actions on behalf of the account holder." Marissa's composure held for another moment. Then she said, "I think if we could just speak with Caleb directly about the full situation, we can resolve any misunderstanding." She looked at me when she said that. Her eyes were doing something that I recognized as an attempt to communicate a message privately in a public setting, the look that says, "Be reasonable." The look that says, "Do not make this difficult." The look that a person gives when they are accustomed to other people accommodating them. I looked back at her without expression. Howard said, "Mrs. Monroe, Mr. Monroe is present and has chosen to be represented today by the documentation his attorney has submitted. If there are things you wish to communicate to Mr. Monroe, his attorney's contact information is on the letter you received this morning." Patricia had not said anything. She was sitting very quietly with her hands in her lap, and for the first time in all of this, I felt something close to sympathy for her, because I did not believe Patricia was a bad person. I believed she was a woman who had trusted her daughter's account of a situation and who was only now beginning to understand that the account had been incomplete. Nathaniel Brooks had closed his folder when Howard first began to speak. He was a professional. He understood immediately what the situation was. He was not going to be part of a transaction that could not proceed legally. He said very little for the rest of the meeting. At one point, he simply said, "I think we all need to take some time." He looked at the table when he said it, not at anyone in particular. He was a man who wanted to be somewhere other than this room. Derek said finally, in a voice that was quieter than I expected, "I do not understand. I thought the authorization covered this." Howard said, "The authorization covered inquiry and discussion, Derek. It did not cover sale facilitation. That was clear in the document's language." Derek said, "But I spoke with people at the bank. I was told that the process could move forward." Howard said, with considerable precision, Conversations about potential options are not the same as authorization to proceed. I understand if that distinction was not entirely clear to you. It should have been communicated more explicitly, and I regret that it was not. But the legal status of the property is not affected by those conversations. The property belongs to your father. He has paid it off in full. Any transaction involving it requires his direct and willing participation. The room was quiet after Howard said that, and then Derek looked at me. It was a different look than any he had given me in a long time. It was not the look of a son executing a plan. It was not the look of a man managing his father. It was something rawer than those things, something that had the quality of a very young man looking at a very specific thing for the first time and not being able to look away. I held his gaze. I did not speak. I let the silence be what it needed to be. Marissa said, "I think we need to step outside for a moment." Derek did not move immediately. He kept looking at me, and I kept looking at him. And in that space between us, in that silence in a conference room at Coastal Heritage Bank on a Monday morning in October, something passed between a father and a son that I do not have precise language for, but that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Then he got up. He followed Marissa out of the conference room. Patricia went with them. Nathaniel gathered his folder and excused himself quietly, and left. Howard and I sat alone in the conference room for a moment. Howard said, "Is there anything else you need from me today, Caleb?" I said, "I think you have done exactly what was needed, Howard. Thank you." He nodded. He stood up. He extended his hand and I shook it. He said, "Your father built that house, didn't he?" He had the chronology slightly wrong, but the spirit of the question was right. I said, "I built that house, 27 years of it." He said, "I know." He picked up his folder and he went back to his office. My father taught me that. He was a man who kept records the way other men kept promises, with the understanding that a record is a kind of promise made to your future self. When you need to know what happened, the record tells you. When someone claims that what happened was different from what actually happened, the record corrects them. My father kept files going back decades, and when he died I found every receipt, every document, every letter organized in a filing cabinet in his study. I understood then, going through those files, that the man in the filing cabinet was the same man I had known in the house, that the discipline of keeping records and the discipline of keeping promises were expressions of the same fundamental character. I keep his filing system as my own. Derek will inherit the metal box someday. I hope that when he opens it, he understands what he is holding. Graham called me in November on a Sunday afternoon. He does not call on a schedule, my brother. He calls when something is in him that needs saying, or when something in the air tells him to check in. He said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Better." He said, "The house okay?" I said, "The house is fine. I fixed the ceiling fan." He said, "Which one?" I said, "Kitchen." He said, "I thought you liked that sound." I said, "I found a new sound." Ace, he laughed the specific way Graham laughs, which is briefly, and from somewhere real, and then we talked for a few minutes about other things, and then he said he had to get back to something in the workshop, and I said all right, and we hung up. That is a complete and full conversation for Graham and me. Every word of it carried weight, and none of it was wasted. I am a lucky man to have a brother like that, and I know it. Reverend Thomas gave a sermon in the first weeks of December that I have thought about many times since. It was not specifically about what I had been through. He did not know the full story in its specific details, only the outline I had shared with him. But the sermon was about the particular courage required to do the right thing when everyone around you is telling you that the right thing is the wrong thing, when your own love for people is being used as an argument against your judgment, when the most powerful pressure you face is not from enemies, but from the people you love most. He said something in that sermon that I wrote down after I got home and that I have kept on the kitchen table where I can see it in the mornings. He said, "A man who protects what he has built is not being selfish. He is being faithful to the labor that built it and to the people who will inherit it." The building was never just for him. Protecting it is never just for him. It is for everyone who comes after. Everyone who will stand on that foundation and build something of their own. Everyone who will someday need to know that the things worth keeping are worth fighting for. I wrote it down because I wanted to have it in plain words. The language of a Southern minister who has spent decades standing at the intersection of the sacred and the human, and who knows that those two things are not as separate as people sometimes pretend. The house on East Bolton Street is quiet at night in the way it has always been quiet. The sounds of it are the sounds I know. The particular creak of the third step on the staircase that I have never fixed, because fixing it would require me to dismantle something structural, and I have decided it is the house's way of telling me when someone is coming up in the dark. The particular sound of the kitchen window when the wind is from the southeast. The sound of the neighbor's wind chimes 2 houses down, that I have been listening to for 17 years. The specific silence of the back porch in the early morning before the birds start. I'm comfortable inside those sounds. I have earned the right to be comfortable inside them, and I will not apologize for that comfort to anyone. Derek started coming to the workshop regularly in January. Not every Saturday, but most of them. The first few weeks he was a man learning something new, which is to say he was patient and attentive and willing to be wrong and willing to start again. He asked the right questions, he made mistakes, and he acknowledged them. He learned the difference between a measurement you can trust and a measurement you want to be true. And once you have learned that difference in woodworking, you have learned it for everything. We worked on a small project together in February. A bookcase, simple in design. The kind of thing that looks easy until you start making it, and then reveals every shortcut you have been tempted to take. He worked on the mortise and tenon joints for the shelves over several Saturdays, getting them wrong and then getting them right, and the morning he finally set the first correctly fitted joint and felt the way it seated without play, the expression on his face was the same expression he had at 12 years old, when he finally understood how something worked and felt. The understanding settled into him as something permanent. I have been waiting to see that expression on his face for a long time. He said, "That is it." I said, "That is it." He said, "That is the right feeling." I said, "That is the only feeling worth working for." We stood in the workshop on a Saturday morning in February with the light coming in through the window and the smell of the sawdust and the oil and the particular smell of that space that belongs to nowhere else on earth. And I thought about what it means to pass something to a son. Not money, not property, not the outcome of a confrontation at a bank, but the understanding of what a correctly fitted joint feels like, the knowledge of the difference between a thing built to last and a thing built to look like it will last, the discipline of measuring twice before you cut once and acknowledging the mistake when you make one and starting again. That is the inheritance that matters. The bookcase is in the living room now. It holds the books I have been reading and the few things I keep on shelves, a photograph of my father, a small piece of driftwood I found on Tybee Island the year Derek was born, the brass key from the original front door lock that I replaced when I first moved in, but that I kept because it was the key that opened this house for the first time, and that weight matters to me. Derek built that bookcase, not alone, but he built it, and every morning when I see it in the living room, I see both of us in it. The small side table I built during those difficult weeks is still next to the chair in the living room. It holds the lamp and the coaster and whatever book I am working through. Last week it held a cup of coffee that was still hot because I remembered to drink it. That table is mine alone. It is the one I built in the weeks when I did not know how things were going to turn out. But I kept building anyway because building is what I know how to do when everything else is uncertain. Both pieces are in the living room now. His and mine. The same room. I want to talk about Elaine for a moment, because I think about her more than I might have expected in the months since all of this happened. Not with any romantic nostalgia. We have been too far from what we were for too many decades for that. But with a kind of gratitude that is specific and real. She raised Derek in the years when I had him only partly. She made choices about who she was raising him to be that I was not there to influence. Some of what happened in the last year probably grew from those choices, but some of what happened in the months of repair that followed, Derek's willingness to sit in the sage-green chair and say what needed to be said, his willingness to come to the workshop and be a beginner at something, his willingness to acknowledge a mistake and start again, some of that also grew from what Elaine built in him in those years. I called her in the spring, not to discuss what had happened in any detail. She had heard pieces of it from Derek. I called to say something that I should have said earlier, and perhaps more often in the years since the divorce, which is that whatever else happened between us, whatever we got wrong in the marriage and in the years of managing the aftermath, she raised a person who has the capacity to become better than he was. That capacity matters. I wanted her to know I acknowledged it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He is your son too, Caleb. Whatever he became, good and bad, you are in there." I said, "I know." She said, "Take care of yourself." I said, "You too, Elaine." We did not say anything more than that. It was exactly enough. The metal box sits in the laundry room cabinet. The house sits on East Bolton Street. The sage green chairs sit on the front porch. The workshop sits at the back of the property, and the tools in it are sharp, and the bench is clear, and the ceiling fan in the kitchen has a new, different sound now that I've fixed it. A smoother one that is not quite as interesting as the old one, but that I appreciate because I fixed it myself on a Tuesday afternoon when there was nothing more urgent to do, and the fixing of it felt like something worth doing for its own sake. I want to talk to you about what I learned. Not as a summary, not as a list of lessons, because a list of lessons is the way a school teacher presents information, and I am not a school teacher, and this is not a classroom. I want to talk about it the way a man on a porch talks about the things he has understood at the end of a long life of paying attention. The first thing I learned, or perhaps the first thing I understood more deeply than I had before, is that love without limit is not the highest form of love. I had always believed, in the way that fathers believe certain things about their children without fully examining the belief, that the measure of a father's love was its unconditionality. That a good father loves without limits and without conditions, and that to impose a limit is to diminish the love. I understand now that this belief, held completely and without examination, was the thing that allowed what happened to happen. Not the only thing, but one of them. A love that has no limits is not only a love that cannot be betrayed. It is also a love that cannot protect. It is a love that says, "Whatever you do to me, I will absorb it, because absorbing it proves the love is real." But absorbing harm is not love. It is the appearance of love performing the function of permission. The real love, the love that serves the beloved as well as the one who loves, draws a line. Not out of anger, not as punishment, but because the line itself says, "This is where I end and you begin, and both of us are real people who deserve to be treated as such, and I will not allow the dissolution of that boundary even by someone I love, because the dissolution of that boundary does not serve either of us well." I drew the line, quietly and absolutely, and from love. And the thing I did not expect, the thing I want to say clearly, because I think it is the most important thing a man in my situation needs to hear, is that drawing the line did not destroy my relationship with my son. It created the conditions under which a real relationship became possible for perhaps the first time in many years. Because a relationship between two people who have no clear boundaries is not actually a relationship between two full people. It is a relationship between a person and the accommodating space around them. Derek was relating to the space I had made around my love, not to me. When I drew the line, when I said this is where I am and this is what I require and this is what I will not accept, Derek for the first time had to relate to me as a full and specific person rather than as an unconditional resource. That was harder for both of us. It is also more real. And I prefer the hard, real thing to the easy performance of it. The second thing I learned is about age, the particular and specific thing they tried to use against me. The implication, never stated directly because direct statement would have been too obviously wrong, but present in every conversation and every decision, and every condescending arrangement, that I was too old to manage my own affairs, that my judgment was suspect, that my attachment to my house was nostalgia rather than legitimate right, that I needed to be managed rather than respected. Here is what I want to say about age. A man of 56 or 60 or 68 or 73 who has spent his adult life building things and fixing things and managing things and surviving things carries inside him a library of experience that a 32-year-old brain cannot access because it has not been written yet. The library is not complete. No library is. There are things a young person understands about their own time that the older person must be willing to learn. But the assumption that the library is no longer useful, that the decades of pattern recognition and professional skill and hard-won wisdom represent diminishment rather than depth, that assumption is not wisdom. It is the particular arrogance of youth, which is the most forgivable arrogance because it is the most temporary. Youth will not be young forever. It will eventually be grateful for what the old man was trying to tell it. I was not too old. I was exactly old enough. Old enough to have relationships at the bank that meant something. Old enough to have an attorney I had worked with for 14 years who took my call immediately. Old enough to have a brother who had known me for 60 years and trusted my judgment without needing an explanation. Old enough to have documentation going back 27 years that created an airtight record. Old enough to have the patience to execute a quiet and deliberate plan rather than a loud and reactive one. The patience alone was the advantage they never saw coming, because they were young enough to believe that speed was power. They moved fast. They had it all arranged. They made the call on Thursday and scheduled the movers for Wednesday. They thought the speed itself was victory. They did not know I had been preparing for months at the pace of a man who is in no hurry because he knows the facts are on his side. Patience is not passivity. Patience is the discipline of waiting for the right moment rather than reacting to every wrong one. It is the difference between a skilled craftsman who measures twice and cuts once, and someone in a hurry who cuts and then wonders why things do not fit together right. The deliberate man and the hasty man may both appear to be working, but only one of them is building something that will hold. The third thing I learned is about the cost of speaking and the cost of silence, because there were months before any of this came to a head when I knew something was wrong and I said nothing, not because I was afraid exactly, but because saying it out loud would have made it real in a way that I was not ready to manage. Because saying it would have required a conversation that I did not want to have. Because I told myself that maybe I was reading too much into things, that maybe the pattern I was seeing was not a pattern, that maybe the son who called less and the daughter-in-law who looked at me like a logistics problem were simply a busy couple with their own demanding life, and I was a father who wanted more than was reasonable to want. I paid a cost for that silence. Not a catastrophic one, but a real one. The months during which things were allowed to advance further than they would have advanced if I had named what I was seeing earlier. The conversations that did not happen because I kept the thing inside rather than bringing it into the room. I am not saying this to assign blame to myself. I am saying it because the person who needs to hear it most is not the person who spoke too soon or too harshly or without evidence. It is the person who has been sitting with the knowledge of something wrong and telling themselves that speaking will cost too much. I understand that telling. I lived inside it for months, and what I found on the other side of it is that the speaking, when it finally came, was both harder and less destructive than I had feared. The things I was afraid speaking would break were either already broken or were strong enough to survive it. And the things I finally said, when I finally said them, cleared the air in a way that silence never could have. Speak when you know something. Do it carefully. Do it with evidence and with the help of people whose judgment you trust. But speak. I want to stop here one more time before I close this out, because we are getting close to the end, and I want to make sure you are still here with me for it. This is the part of the story that matters most to me, the part after everything else, the quiet, ordinary morning part, and I do not want to talk to an empty room. Tell me where you are right now, your city, your state. Drop it in the comments because I am going to be reading every single one, and I want to picture you where you are while I am finishing this, and if this story has been sitting with you through these hours, if it has been the kind of story that you felt rather than just heard, please leave a like. It helps this channel more than you know, and it tells me that what I am doing here is worth doing. Subscribe if you have not already, because there is a new story on this channel every day, and some of those stories are going to find you at exactly the right moment. Share this one if you know someone who needs to hear that. The people who were underestimated are sometimes the most prepared. And let me give you what I promised at the start, which is the real ending, not the dramatic one, the true one. The East Bolton Street house in late May is something I cannot fully describe to someone who has not been in a Savannah spring at the right hour of the morning. The air has warmth in it, but not yet the heavy weight of summer. The jasmine has come back, as it always does, and the smell of it in the morning when the windows are open is the smell of every morning I have lived in this house for 27 years. The live oaks are doing what they do, holding the light in their canopies and releasing it in pieces onto the street. And the street is doing what it does, which is to receive all of this without comment, because it has been receiving it for longer than anyone now alive can remember. I sit on the front porch with my coffee. The coffee is hot. I have remembered to drink it. The sage green chairs are exactly as they have always been, one holding me and one holding the possibility of whoever might come to sit in it. Derek came last Saturday and sat in it for 3 hours while we worked through a problem he was having with a tenon joint in the project he has taken on by himself, a small side table of his own design that he has been working on for 6 weeks, and that is beginning to look like something worth keeping. We argued briefly about the angle of the shoulder cut, and then he tried it my way, and then he tried it his way, and then we looked at both results, and he said mine was better, and I said I was glad he could see that, and he laughed and went back to work. There was a moment in the afternoon, in the quiet of the workshop with both of us at the bench and the late Saturday light coming through the window and the particular sound of two people working together in a shared space, when I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel in a long time, something that had to do with the future rather than only with the present, something that looked ahead along the line of time, and saw the house still there, and the workshop still there, and the work continuing in some form. I could not fully picture, but could sense an outline. Something that is the particular form of peace available only to a man who has built something and has reason to believe it will be kept. I held that feeling carefully, like something you find on a walk that you are not sure is as fragile as it looks, turning it slightly to see what it is. It was hope, just that. Simple and ordinary, and almost embarrassingly straightforward. It was hope, the kind that is not a wish but a reasonable expectation based on evidence. The evidence being a son who shows up on Saturdays and asks the right questions and acknowledges his mistakes and is trying, genuinely and with some cost to himself, to become the man I have always believed he was capable of being. That is not a victory in any dramatic sense of the word. It is something quieter and more valuable. It is the beginning of the answer to a question I have been sitting with since Derek was 12 years old, and I was doing the particular hard work of building a family across 2 households and 1 difficult divorce and all the years of distance and closeness that followed. The question was simply this: was the love enough? Not the love without limits that I had been practicing, but the love that finally drew a line and held it. The love that said, I will not let you treat me as though I do not matter, and still I will keep the door open, and still I will make the coffee, and still I will show you what a correctly fitted joint feels like when you finally get it right. Was that love enough? The bookcase is in the living room. The side table is next to the chair. The workshop is at the back of the property. The sage green chairs are on the front porch. The metal box is in the laundry room cabinet. The deed is in the metal box. The house is on East Bolton Street. I am in the house. I believe the answer is yes. Now, let me say something to you before I close. Something I have been building toward since the first word of this story. Something I want to leave you with that is not a dramatic finale, but is the thing that is most true about everything I have told you. You are going to be where I was. If you have not been there already, you are going to arrive at a moment in your life when the people around you, people you love, people you trusted, people you sacrificed for, are going to look at what you have built and see a resource rather than a life. They are going to look at your age and see an argument for someone else's authority. They are going to look at your house or your money or your business or your land or your legacy and see something to be managed, divided, reorganized, or simply taken, and they are going to tell themselves that this is for your benefit, that you should be grateful, that you do not understand how things work now, that they are handling it. And in that moment you are going to feel the particular loneliness of a person who knows what is real and cannot make anyone else see it. I want you to hear me when I say this. You are not wrong. Your perception is accurate. Your experience is real. The thing you are seeing is what it looks like. The fact that no one around you is willing to confirm it does not make it less real. It makes the confirmation harder to obtain. But the truth does not require a consensus to be true. The deed says what the deed says. The receipts say what the receipts say. The authorization form says what the authorization form says. The facts exist regardless of the story being constructed around them. Find the facts, organize them, get the right help. An attorney who knows what they are doing. A bank manager who respects the actual legal situation. A brother, a friend, a neighbor, a pastor, someone who owes you nothing and offers you something anyway, because that is the kind of person they are. These people exist in your life too. Find them. Do not make noise when everyone expects you to make noise. The man who stays quiet and organized when everyone expects him to be confused and reactive has an advantage that cannot be overstated. The patience of a man who has been building things for 50 years is not a limitation. It is the most dangerous thing in the room. Draw the line. Draw it with love. Draw it with evidence. Draw it with the help of people who know the law and the language and the procedures. And draw it absolutely, not as punishment, not as revenge, as the simple and dignified assertion that you are a person, that what you built is yours, that your life is yours to live on your terms, and that anyone who says otherwise is going to find out that they misread the situation at considerable cost to themselves. You built something. It is yours. And the fact that you are older now than when you built it does not transfer ownership to anyone else, not legally, not morally, not in any way that a properly organized set of facts cannot refute completely. One more thing, the most important thing maybe, that I have to say. Protect yourself, not instead of the people you love, not at the expense of the people you love, but as a necessary precondition of continuing to love them at all. Because a man who lets himself be erased cannot protect anyone. A man who lets himself be managed and relocated and decided about until he is no longer recognizable to himself cannot be the father, or the grandfather, or the brother, or the friend that anyone around him needs. Protecting yourself is not selfish. It is the foundation on which every other act of love depends. The house is the foundation. Keep the house. And one final thing, the last one, the thing I want to say to the person who has been listening to every word of this, and who is not an old man in Savannah with a metal box and a workshop and a set of sage green chairs, but who recognizes something in this story that is also their story. Something about being told that what you know is not what you know. Something about being asked to accept an arrangement that requires you to disappear. Something about love being used as the argument for your own diminishment. You do not have to accept the arrangement. You are allowed to say, I understand, and mean something entirely different by it. You are allowed to open the cabinet and take out the box and sit at the table and look at the facts. You are allowed to make a phone call at midnight and buy a plane ticket in the same hour. You are allowed to have a brother who says, come, the guest room is clear, without requiring you to explain the whole thing first. You are allowed to walk into the bank on Monday morning with a set of organized facts and a letter from your attorney and a lifetime of knowing how things actually work, and watch the carefully constructed story come apart in the professional silence of a man who looked at his screen and saw the numbers and said, this property belongs to its owner. He paid it off. You are allowed to keep what you built. It is yours. Keep it. Now, before I let you go, I have one last thing to ask of you, and it is a small thing, but it means a great deal to me. If you have been here for this whole story, If you sat with me from the cold coffee on Thursday night all the way to this May morning on the front porch with the hot coffee and the jasmine, and the live oaks doing what they do, if you felt any piece of this story as something real and true, then leave me a comment with just one word. The word is foundation. Just that. No explanation needed. Just foundation in the comments, and I will know you were truly here. I will know you heard what I was really saying. Because the foundation is everything. What you build on it, the house, the family, the relationships, the love, the life, all of it depends on the foundation holding. And a foundation holds when the person who built it refuses to let it be moved. That is the whole story. Subscribe if you have not, because there is a new story here every single day, and this old man has more to say than he expected. Leave a like if this story gave you anything worth having. Share it with someone who needs to hear that a man who builds something and refuses to let it be taken is one of the most powerful forces in the ordinary world. And share it with anyone who has ever been told that their age makes their judgment suspect, because that person needs to know that the library of a long life is not a limitation. It is the advantage no one sees coming. I appreciate you being here more than I can properly express. Sitting with someone in a hard story is a gift. You gave that to me tonight, and I am grateful for it. Take care of what you built. Take care of the people who deserve your care. Take care of yourself first, so that the other two are possible. Good night. From East Bolton Street in Savannah, Georgia, where the jasmine is coming through the window, and the coffee is still hot, and the house is still mine. Good night.